welcome back to another podcast episode on Lime Nor Reason with JRC. This is Season 2, Episode 16, and we will talk about and decide the rationality of historical issues.
Today's subject is in response to a question we got on our last episode regarding American foreign policy during the Cold War.
The question we received in the comments section that we got from T Gladiator 2024 was, do you think that America grew into the nation it was intended to be? Thank you, Mr. Gladiator. This is a fascinating question and one that we can in part answer with this week's topic, the Cold War. I for one don't think that America's initial goals were sustained from its origins in the late 1700s. The world has changed a lot since then, and we've had to change with it. So I'm still on the fence, but I'm leaning towards no. What about you guys?
Yeah, I totally agree. After the Revolutionary War, George Washington and other prominent leaders were very vocal about what they thought should be America's next steps as a new nation. But we are no longer a new nation, and the world has also changed greatly. So let's try to answer this question using our more modern foreign policies.
Yes, let's do this. But first, we need a little background information about the pre-Cold War era. After World War II, the U.S. became a global superpower after defeating the Axis powers like Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was the only major war power to not have suffered the destruction of fighting on its lands and lost relatively fewer soldiers than its allies. On the other hand, the USSR lost an estimated 10 million soldiers and an equal number of civilians. The pre-Cold War era consisted of tensions and political rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union over the spread of communism and capitalism. The U.S. looked to restrict communism in the nation, while the Soviet Union wanted to expand communism under their leader Joseph Stalin.
The Soviet Union caused many conflicts, both at home and in America, and abroad. The fear of communism swam across the Atlantic in the early 1920s, leading to neighbors and friends turning against each other, trying to root out anyone who may be a communist. But that same fear came back as Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution came to power, causing another Red Scare back at home. Across the world, however, conflicts were starting to take place as communism attempted to spread throughout Asia and Europe, later leading to American intervention in conflicts such as the Vietnam War. The conflict even reached the Western Hemisphere, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Pew pew! Hi, I am Jay, and I will be your first host of the night, and I'll be talking about the missiles and weapons of this era and the effects they caused. During World War II, the Manhattan Project was in full swing. Because of high tensions, a race started to see who could make the first atomic weapons. By the end of 1938, German scientists had discovered fission, a chain of nuclear reactions vital for atomic weapons to work. Once a Hungarian physicist realized the danger of this discovery, he urged Albert Einstein to help the USA create the weapons first so that Germany wouldn't become even more powerful than it already was on the global scale. In the following years, scientists worked closely together to create the weapons, which required precise numbers and calculations. And on July 16, 1945, thanks to the United States Manhattan Project, the first nuclear weapon was detonated, signaling the beginning of a new and dreadful era called the Atomic Age.
What signaled it as a dreadful era?
Well, people around the world may have heard about the destruction these weapons could cause, but no one truly understood the gravity until August 6, 1945, when the USA dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. On August 9th, they dropped another on Nagasaki, Japan, making the United States the first and, as of now, the only nation to use such weapons of mass destruction. It helped to end the war, yes, but at what cost? Many civilian lives and livelihoods were disrupted and destroyed. As a reflection of what happened in these cities, Einstein himself said, "If I had foreseen Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I would have torn up my formula in 1905. There were destroyed city blocks, hundreds and thousands dead, increased miscarriages and cancer rates, and many more effects as a result of the usage of these weapons. Though they are hard to stomach, I would encourage people to search for drawings that survivors drew after the bombings and pictures of the wreckage left behind because they give a slight peek into their reality, and it wasn't a pretty one."
Why would the USSR want to make a bomb too then? Why did the USA become so competitive over it?
That's a good question. In part, both places came out of World War II as global superpowers. However, though they had worked together during the war, tensions between the two nations began to rise since they only were together because of a common enemy, and they no longer had that. The tensions were mostly fueled by the conflicting ideologies of communism and capitalism. In order for each to work, however, they were going to need other nations with similar ideas. So each place tried to spread its influence around the world. And how do you do that?
Power?
It's always power. During these times, the power gained began to be strongly correlated to the weapons each place had. By 1952, other places like Britain had also been able to create atomic bombs, but no other place got close to the production that was happening in the United States and Soviet Union. During this era, the atomic weapons became such an integral part of everyday life, leading to symbols of nuclear weapons in advertisements and popular culture, as well as the rise in bomb shelters and bomb drills within the United States.
So everyone felt the effect of these weapons' existence, including everyday people, not just military personnel?
Oh, absolutely. Though it is true that a lot of the fighting during the Cold War was done in places like Korea and Vietnam, since there was mutually assured destruction if the USA and USSR were to fight directly, there were still some efforts made, though. One of the most infamous occurrences of this was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba had aligned itself with the USSR and their ideals, making them the closest communist ally to the United States. The USSR eventually tried to make use of this proximity and began to send nuclear missiles to Cuba. But the USA noticed, and the two sides had to begin negotiating. Eventually, they decided that the Soviets would take down the Cuban missiles and the Americans would take down some of their own missiles they had placed in Turkey. It was beginning to be clear that both sides had reached a stalemate, in which none truly had the upper hand, and it was just creating more anxiety all over the world.
Did they begin to change their policies?
A little, actually. In 1963, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was created. It essentially stated the detonation of nuclear weapons was banned in the atmosphere, underwater, and outer space. More on that later. Even if they weren't being actively used in conflict, the testing of the weapons was also banned. Only a couple years later, the USA and USSR signed another treaty to limit themselves, SALT.
Salt?
Yes. Well, it stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, and it did just that. Again, during these later years, we began seeing a lot more cooperation from both sides, hoping to create a more peaceful environment. A lot of the connections can be made, but personally, I do think that a lot of the changes in policies stemmed heavily from the Cuban Missile Crisis, since both sides noticed they were very equally matched in the weaponry and threat aspects. So, fighting with brute force wasn't going to make any side win. It would just ruin everyone. These same sentiments are further showcased by the passage of SALT Part 2 in 1979.
So back to the question at hand. Did USA grow into the nation it was meant to be?
My opinion as of now, yes and no. Again, originally it was meant to be very isolated so we could work on our internal issues, but as time went on, these issues got mostly resolved, which made the US have more time to get involved in international affairs. I do think that the Founding Fathers would have wanted the U.S. to become a global power, though. From its humble beginnings of 13 colonies just wanting freedom to being at the top of the world, well, it sounds good. It sounds appealing. But also, I don't think that they would have ever meant for us to create such weapons of mass destructions. And especially, I don't think they would have meant for us to be the first and only nation to use them not just once, but twice. What do you guys think?
Write down your answers for a chance to be featured in the next episode of Lime Nor Reason. And don't forget to like and subscribe to never miss our weekly podcast episodes. Howdy, y'all. I'm C, and I will be your second host for the night as we talk about politics and my favorite part, spies. Politics in the Cold War were notoriously shaky, or shivery. But through the Cold War, the U.S. employed special legislation and spies and took advantage of international alliances to help maintain political stability. Soon after the end of World War II, we faced our first domestic challenges with communism spread in the form of the Second Red Scare. The consequences of this were hysteria among the public, the conviction of neighbors, and widespread confusion across the U.S. It affected our politics in the form of McCarthyism, which was used to silence leftist politics under the guise that they were socialists and communists among them. In order to combat and restore stability to the government, the U.S. Supreme Court, led by Justice Earl Warren, opposed laws such as the Smith Act of 1940. What the Smith Act did was say you cannot advocate for violent uprising against the U.S. government
which would make sense if it wasn't manipulated into a way to get away with prosecution and violence against accused anarchists and communists. Through Yates versus United States 1957 court case, Warren and the Supreme Court helped return the power balance by restricting social and political legislation.
As we well know, the Cold War was an international conflict. What was going on in the international stage?
Well, the Warsaw Pact and NATO politics were a major part of the Cold War political battlefield, as international issues were spread through alliances based on similar political systems. In order to better protect their home country, many political leaders on both sides of the conflict would reach out and form alliances between countries with similar goals, NATO among the anti-communist nations and the Warsaw Pact among the communist nations. These teams would work together, often engaging in favorable trade and economics, military benefits, and political security. One benefit of the Warsaw Pact for Soviet Russia was that it was the first step towards strengthening their satellite states network, which was not orbital technology, but instead a communist-controlled territory, most of which are now free to make up nations like Albania, Hungary, or Poland. The Soviet Union also used the treaty by sending Warsaw troops into Czechoslovakia in order to deal with an uprising against the government. However, the Warsaw Pact was declared non-existent in 1991, with most of the nations, with the exception of Russia, joining NATO instead. Time to talk about spies. Spies themselves are not all they're made out to be in movies and books. They don't wear three-piece suits, and they don't have car chases around Europe, as cool as that would be. But they are typically assassins, incredibly smart, resourceful, and essential to the political stability of their nations, such as our spies in the Cold War. During the Cold War, many spies were caught, killed, and tortured in their line of work, as it was important information that they carried, all for the continued security of their nations. The goal of these spies was to bring back important information to their side in order to gain the advantage over the enemy. This scary work would often include passing documents, kidnapping or assassination, stealing military information, and infiltrating the opposition's territory. With the rise of atomic bomb technology, fear was a good motivator to sneak behind enemy lines, learn as much as they could, and get out.
As we've learned, atomic bombs were one of the most destructive and terrifying tools of war during the time. And if spies could help inform scientists and strategists about this, we stood a much better chance at survival.
In the midst of the Cold War, all of the major forces maintained a section of government dedicated to espionage and intelligence gathering. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, is the American intelligence operation. Initially operating as the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, during the Second World War, it was innovated and molded into today's CIA. Their first major mission was in 1948 when they aided non-communist political parties in Italy. Since then, they have been involved with several Cold War events and, from 1959 to 1961, trained 1,500 Cuban exiles who went on to infiltrate Cuba under the leadership of Fidel Castro in an event historically known as the Bay of Pigs. Circling back to the focus question here, what role do you guys think that the Cold War spies in politics would play in the nation's original intentions? I would say that if the purpose of America was seen as an institution of democracy, its political efforts were set up to help prevent communism from spreading, and it gave way to an international organization called NATO to help do so, as well as work to try and stop communism from weakening the core beliefs of our nation, which were protected by efforts like Justice Earl Warren. However, the point can definitely be made that our initial policy of neutrality was never supposed to end us up in the middle of a global conflict. On that end, my answer is still very much so on the fence, but I'm leaning towards yes now, as the theme of democracy remains at the core of our intentions, despite our growth and innovations to our nation changing much of what we were since 1776.
Hi, I'm R. I will be your last host of the night, where we talk about scientific achievements during the Cold War era that have significantly impacted the nation. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the U.S. by launching the first satellites, Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2, into orbit around the Earth. The success of Sputnik had a major impact on the Cold War and the U.S. The U.S. feared that they had fallen behind and demanded that U.S. policymakers accelerate space and weapons programs. However, U.S. rockets designed to duplicate the Soviet achievement failed repeatedly, which added to the embarrassment of the U.S.
Ooh, how did Congress respond to that?
In 1958, Congress passed the National Defense and Education Act, or NDEA, which authorized giving hundreds of millions in federal money to schools for math, science, and foreign language education. Additionally, it provided student loans to college students who were pursuing education in these fields. The act also provided funding to schools and libraries to purchase educational materials, including books. Furthermore, it provided scholarships for students in these fields. Congress also created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, to direct the U.S. efforts to build missiles and explore outer space. It was established by Eisenhower's National Aeronautics and Space Act.
What was the impact of Sputnik on the U.S.?
The launch of Sputnik fueled both the space race and the arms race, in addition to increasing Cold War tensions, as each country worked to prepare new methods of attacking the other. This leads to our last topic, the space race. In April 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth, traveling in a capsule-like spacecraft. The U.S. effort to send a man into space was called Project Mercury. During this time, NASA engineers designed a small, more miniature-shaped capsule far lighter than the Russian one. They tested the craft with chimpanzees and held a final test flight in March 1961. On May 5th, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space, though not in orbit.
Oh wow, that's so interesting. Wait, what else did NASA do during the space race?
The Gemini program was then launched, learning about what happened to astronauts while in space and going outside of the aircraft. In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth, and by the end of that year, the foundations of NASA's lunar landing program named Project Apollo were in place. From 1961 to 1964, NASA's budget was increased by almost 500%, and the lunar landing program eventually involved some 34,000 NASA employees and 375,000 employees of industrial and university contractors.
I'm curious, what were some of the hardships of this period?
Apollo suffered a setback in January 1967 when 3 Apollo 1 astronauts were killed after their spacecraft caught fire during launch simulation. December 1968 saw the launch of Apollo 8, the first manned space mission to orbit the moon. On July 16, 1969, U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on the Apollo 11 space mission, the first lunar landing attempt. After landing successfully on July 20th, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon's surface. Television viewers around the world witnessed the astronauts' sight of 2 American astronauts walking on the moon's surface.
What was the significant result of U.S. astronauts landing on the moon?
Well, by landing on the moon, the United States effectively won the space race that had begun with Sputnik's launch in 1957. There would be a total of 17 Apollo missions, supposed to be 20, but the budget was caught, with men returning to the moon multiple times. Many remember Apollo 13, another crew that was supposed to make it to the moon, but had several catastrophic failures in space and still remarkably made it back to Earth.
How did the space race demonstrate the U.S. as a dominant power in the world?
The space race was considered important because it showed the world which country had the best science, technology, and economic system. The technological advantages required for such power were seen as necessary for national security and political dominance. The space race produced groundbreaking efforts to launch artificial satellites, space probes of the moon, Venus and Mars, and human space voyages in low Earth orbit and lunar missions.
Well, that about wraps up this episode. Now all that's left is to answer this question. Did America grow into the nation it was intended to be?
My personal opinion didn't really change from the beginning. Though it is true that America has been known to be a protector of democracy, would the early Americans really agree with the measures that the U.S. has taken in more recent years? I don't have a concrete answer for that, but it's good food for thought.
There were many techniques and methods put into place in order to maintain political stability, including the Yates v. United States case under Justice Earl Warren, international alliances such as NATO, and the use of espionage for continued national security. While this doesn't work in perfect harmony with our goals to remain neutral, I would say at this point it would be inevitable to remain completely neutral, aligned with our goals to spread and maintain democracy in the U.S. and amongst our allies.
During the Cold War, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were trying to outcompete each other, especially with technological and scientific advancements. Each nation was trying to be a global superpower because, as we said before, power was the key to spread a nation's influence. America faced several challenges and complexities that impacted its ability to fully grow into the nation it was initially intended to be. The Cold War was characterized by global ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The clash between capitalism and communism shaped American foreign policy and domestic dynamics. The need to contain communism and promote American interests often led to compromises on democratic principles and interventions in other countries, which some argue were inconsistent with the ideals of freedom and self-determination. Overall, I would say that the U.S. did not grow into the nation it intended to be.
Well, that's it for today, folks. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Lime Nor Reason, hosted by yours truly, JRC, and we hope to see you return next week.
Thank you for all your support, and join our Patreon to support our future college debt. Perks of being a Patreon are getting the episodes one day early, getting full access to behind-the-scenes content, and bloopers. Well, that is it, and thank you for listening. See you next time.